All right. Well, so David, let's go through the elections last night. They mostly all primaries, although there was a couple of special elections for some state races. And
Yeah.
this I guess to the extent that there's a summation, a meme going around, and that is to a certain extent, like, is this, and I think this is a little bit sloppy, but there was a little bit of Tea Party action from the Democratic base, or really, it's just really more the progressive base is picking up a little bit of steam.
Yeah, I mean, I think to call it Tea Party action is, that equivalence seems false to me. But yes, it's definitely the case that candidates who you would see as more progressive, who on an ideological scale would be more liberal, did do very well last night. This was also correlated with the fact that female candidates did quite well last night. But there are a number of races, particularly in Pennsylvania, where Democrats really turned out, and liberal Democrats really turned out. You saw both in the House races, in the statewide race for lieutenant governor, where an incumbent lost, actually finished in fourth, and John Fetterman, who is this hulking, tattooed candidate from Braddock, Pennsylvania, ended up becoming the nominee. And even the state legislative races in Western Pennsylvania, where two members of Democratic Socialists of America defeated two brothers in separate races who were longtime kind of political dynasty conservative Democrats in the state legislature in Pennsylvania. And those races were won by the two DSA members. So, and I think DSA won 4 out of 5 state legislative seats that they participated in Pennsylvania. So, yeah, I mean, you definitely saw an ideological desire to put forward big ideas and big solutions to our problems.
Now, I think those two guys, I think they're cousins. I don't know if they're brothers, but that's not.
Oh, they're not brothers?
It's not terribly relevant. They're related, I guess. They come from the same
They have the same last name.
Same last name and same sort of, I guess, quasi-political dynasty. But yeah, you were saying there was 100,000 more ballots that were cast by Democrats than Republicans in Pennsylvania. In Erie County, where Trump got most of his 2016 victory, 5,000 more Democrats voted than Republicans. In Charlie Dent's open seat in the Lehigh Valley, there were 42,000 votes in the Democratic primary, and which was
and by the way, those things can sometimes be misleading because
right.
You have competitive races on one side and not on the other. But it was the case that the top of the ticket in the primary in Pennsylvania had competitive races on the Republican side and not on the Democratic side. You had an incumbent governor, Tom Wolf, an incumbent senator, Bob Casey, who are both Democrats, and you had contested primaries to challenge them on the Republican side. So logic would indicate that you would have more Republicans coming out because they had something to vote for. And yet you still had that outcome, and that suggests that the enthusiasm gap is, at least in Pennsylvania, pretty large.
And the other dynamic here was that, and you mentioned this, I mean, you implied it to a certain extent, but there was a lot of cases of a candidate not supported by the establishment, by the DCCC, in some instances by Emily's List, that ended up winning anyways. And this is in contrast to last week, where we didn't have quite this dynamic, where a lot of the sort of the Justice Dems and the Our Revolution candidates lost. You mentioned that there are 2 DSA candidates that won and are basically won the general election now because there's no Republicans running against them. And
there's actually no Republican running, yeah. And then the big DCCC versus, establishment versus outsider race was in Nebraska. in a seat that's flipped back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. Kara Eastman, who is a pro-choice social worker, ended up winning very narrowly over Brad Ashford, who was DCCC endorsed and a former congressman who once held this seat and was trying to get it back. And he's a anti-choice, moderates conservative who has a conservative voting record in his one term in Congress, and so that's a really interesting race, and of course what will remain to be seen is whether, given that is a swing seat, whether the Democratic campaign committees will actually stay in the race, whether they will now support Kara Eastman, or whether they will, assume the race is lost because there's some wild-eyed progressive who is running in the general election.
And let me ask you this, and I don't want to be cynical about this, but would that be the only reason why they don't enter that race? In other words, is it possible that it's not just a question of we assess that she's not going to win, so we're not going to be in?
Right.
Or is there also sort of an element of put aside ideology for a moment and just simply put in sort of the almost quasi-corporate mentality of I want to keep my job? She can't win.
Yeah.
Because if she wins, then I look like an idiot. And
right.
I mean, this race.
Well, that's a very interesting case that you make, and just to preview something that I will have out later this week, there's some interesting political science research around whether parties support moderate candidates, which I think is pretty well established, whether they support them strategically because moderates tend to do better in these swing seats, or whether it's sincere. And the way that this particular researcher looked at it is that he looked at races where there was a competitive general election, or the expectation of a competitive general election, and races that were expected to be blowouts, where the strategic factor wasn't supposed to be, an indicator because it didn't matter. You were either going to be a safe seat or a seat that's completely out of reach. And what he found is that party support for moderates is actually stronger in the non-competitive seats than it is in the competitive seats. In both cases, parties support moderate candidates, but it doesn't seem strategic in any way. It seems far more sincere. So to answer your question, yes, there's a kind of, I have to justify my job and justify this idea that we know best, what is the case in these races. But there's this also sort of denial of reality that party organizations, this loose affiliated network of elected officials and campaign committees and donors, they have an ideological agenda of their own. And that is usually denied in favor of this idea that they're strategic geniuses. But if you look at the data, it appears that they are just as ideological on a different level as party activists.
Right. They just have a different ideology.
Correct. And
it's also the case with Kara Eastman that she did not get funding from Emily's List. Is that right?
That's correct. So this is a pro-choice woman running against a anti-choice man in a Democratic primary, and the national groups largely stayed out. And, there is certainly a linkage between Emily's List and the DCCC. You see that in race after race across the country. There may be a reluctance on the part, even though, this is kind of a tailor-made seat for Emily's List to get involved in. There may be a reluctance to go against the national party in a big primary race. But, we'll see if Emily's List jumps in now.
What's fascinating about this race is that if you remember, and it didn't necessarily work out too great, in some respects it did. But do you remember when Marcus Melitzis, the proprietor of Daily Kos, basically adopted John Tester and said that he was going to make that race about putting a stake through the heart of the DLC? That John Tester was a much better candidate. I remember when he went out there and he was talking about, like, I talked to the guy. He was literally sitting on his tractor, and we're going to do this case. We're gonna push him in the primary as a way of taking out the DLC, and they were effective. Obviously, John Tester went on to win that primary. He won his election. John Tester did not turn out to be the guy that I think Marcus or any of us hoped that he would be. But with that said, there was a lot of other factors, but the DLC, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't exist anymore in and of itself, but even what it represented in the party is also highly diminished, right? I mean, we still have moderates, but you don't, and still have maybe occasionally a blue dog, although you rarely hear about that. No Labels was involved in some of these Democratic primaries, if I'm not mistaken. But I wonder if this seat, more than any other, is an opportunity to, because if I'm at the DCCC right now, I have got to be very careful, because if I stay away from this race and Eastman still wins, I look really bad. But if I get in and help her win, I still have the opportunity of looking sort of bad in that I didn't support her in the beginning, right? I mean, so.
And if they don't get in and she loses and they try to dunk on a Democrat losing, that doesn't look great either. I don't think they're in much of a winning situation. We can look to history. You know, you mentioned the Tester race, but I think actually a closer analog for this particular race is in 2006. There was a race in New Hampshire with Carol Shea Porter. And Carol Shea Porter beat a conservative Democrat in the primary, and the DCCC bugged out. They said, there's no way this anti-war activist would have any shot at winning a general election. We're out. And it turns out she won. She won the general election. And so that didn't seem to stop the dynamic necessarily, but it did show in that case, and there were a couple others. Jerry McNerney in California, who still is there today, he beat a right-wing Democrat, and the DCCC kind of left that race, and he won the general election. It's certainly possible. I mean, there isn't really a hard and fast rule. There's some political science research that shows that more quote unquote extreme candidates do worse in general elections, but you have to define your terms as to what is extreme. Right. Is supporting the idea of health care for all Americans an extreme idea? Is supporting the idea that we should not make education completely unaffordable to large sections of the population an extreme idea? That's the kind of thing, when you talk about this sort of extremism or radicalism, you have to kind of define your terms.
Yeah, and I think more than in those past cycles, and I think those are good analogs, but more in those past cycles, the DCCC is under, I think, a lot more scrutiny. And
that's true.
And there is, if not the least of which, stories that have come out of The Intercept, one of the places that you write for.
Right.
And even
not highlights this time.
And even I would say the Theda Scotchwell and Lena Putnam research, not as ideologically ideology didn't seem quite as relevant, but this notion of the DCCC coming in and not knowing what they were doing and telling local people that they did, that dynamic is clearly there. And so, like, as an enterprise, they're under a lot of scrutiny, it seems to me.
That's true. And mostly the one thing I would add is that the definition of a wave election is that it sweeps in people who have a certain label, a Democratic label in this case, attached to them, regardless of really their political, the granular nature of their political ideology. If this is a national election where opposition to Donald Trump is driving massive turnout and will push Democrats in because they want to put a check on the power of the presidency, then does it matter exactly what political stance a certain candidate takes or not? That's I think it kind of undercuts this argument that you have to trim your sails in these particular seats and go with the most bland, moderate candidate you can find.
Right. Well, so that's. Did we leave any of those out? We spoke about Idaho, the gubernatorial primary. I think Paulette Jordan won, and that was also another sort of progressive win there too over a.
That's going to be a difficult race to win.
Yes, of course, but it is encouraging to see. That
but
type
the turnout matched what we saw in these other races where the model in the one Democratic kind of bastion in Idaho and Boise, she did this amazing turnout. So that is notable.
Pennsylvania, of course, is a huge linchpin because that could possibly provide about a quarter of the seats needed for the Democrats to pick up in 2018, coming from Pennsylvania alone.
And that's because of redistricting.
Yep.
That's because the state Supreme Court said that the maps that the Republican legislature put together were illegal, unconstitutional, and these new maps provide a real opportunity for Democrats to pick up seats.
And we should say, women, like you had mentioned, I think at the top, women won 17 out of the 20 races that they were involved in. So that I don't know about that number is exactly right, but certainly
it's in the ballpark.
Yeah, it's in the ballpark, and it certainly is indicative of everything that we understand about this era, which is that women, particularly women of color, depending on the locality.
Just personally, I'm looking at my ballots. California votes in a few weeks, and if I have a judge's race and there are two candidates and all things being equal, I'm going to pick the woman. I think that our representation in legislatures and elected office more generally is appalling in terms of the gender balance. And I think we need to make that right.